So here we are again. The 2024 reading season is over, and today we're going to crown some champions. At the end of every month, I update my top 10 list, and this is going to be the last one before we completely clean the slate and start again in 2025 with a fresh new top 10 list. I read 80 books in 2024, and these are the best 10. So I'm going to tell you what they are in reverse order, and we're starting with the 10th best book that I read this year, and that is Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist. So Let the Right One In was a recommendation from one of my subscribers called Skunk. So I just want to say a quick thank you. Skunk said that this would be a perfect winter read. And so I actually just finished this in like a couple of weeks ago in the beginning of December. It's set in a bleak Swedish suburb during the 1980s. And the main character is Oscar. Oscar's like a lonely boy who is being relentlessly bullied at school. And when we first meet him, he is just completely powerless. He's humiliating himself for the entertainment of others to avoid getting beaten up. He just feels as though he's got no one in life that he can turn to. But that all changes when a new neighbor moves in down the street, and her name is Elaine. And she appears to be, slightly younger than him, but she's a little bit mysterious. She only comes out at night, and she seems to be strangely physically strong. And it's not long before Oscar discovers that Elaine isn't an ordinary child, and she is in fact a vampire. So last year I read Salem's Lot, and I loved the portrayal of vampires in that story because to me it felt like a realistic take on how vampires might exist. If they really existed, this is how they would be if they existed in our world. And Let the Right One In kind of does something similar to that. What really stood out to me was how this book has the perfect blend of brutality and tenderness. It's definitely brutal and bloody, and there's really horrific moments in this, but there's also mixed into it some touching and gentle moments. It feels to me like this isn't just a horror novel, but it's also kind of like a coming-of-age story as well. The narrative is constantly shifting between these quiet and intimate exchanges between characters that you grow to love, and then all of a sudden you'll be hit with like a shocking scene of extreme violence. And that contrast between the two is really jarring, and it makes the horrific moments more horrific, and it makes the tender moments more tender. Mwah! This might actually be my favorite vampire story of all time. I know that's a big statement, right? Because I read Salem's Lot last year, and that's hard to beat. This might be getting the benefit of like recency bias because I read it this month. I just fell in love with it. Maybe Salem's Lot is a little bit better, but whichever one it is, it's a tough battle between the two. Coming in at number 9, I feel like a Top of the Pops host. It's Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. So this is the story of Fitz, and Fitz is a royal bastard. He's raised in the castle stables until one day the king decides that actually this young lad, although his birth might not be seen as legitimate, might actually be useful for the kingdom's survival during this like brewing civil war. Thanks to his royal blood, Fitz can access a type of magic called the skill. And this allows him to communicate with others telepathically, and he can even manipulate the minds of others. Basically, it's like he can do like Jedi mind tricks. He also has another ability called the wit, which lets him communicate with animals in a similar way. Although this is deeply frowned upon in this world. People say, don't get mixed up in all that, because if you communicate with animals telepathically, they will communicate with you, and then slowly you will start to become more of an animal. So just neglect that part of your ability. I think one of the things that I like most about Assassin's Apprentice is how Robin Hobb focuses a lot on sensory details in her writing. For example, when Fitz goes down to the docks, the narrative focuses on things like the sound of the waves lapping against the stone, or the smell of slightly rotting fish. And then when he comes in from the cold and he stands by the fire, you can practically like feel the warmth of the crackling flames against your own skin as you read it. And it made me realize how much those little details really matter to me when I'm reading. Since the main character, Fitz, is training to be an assassin, there's a little bit of like a Harry Potter vibe to the story when he's brought into the castle and he starts exploring all of the hidden rooms and starts attending classes and uncovering layers of political intrigue. There's a character who's a little bit like a Professor Snape in it. Something I think I've said before about this book is that when I read Robin Hobb, it doesn't feel like I'm reading a book so much as it does that I'm going to a destination. You know, it's so immersive in that way. Feels like you're taking a little break from the real world. The 8th best book that I read in 2024 was Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This one is, you know, an absolute sci-fi classic. It's set in a far future in another universe where 7 strangers have all come together for a pilgrimage to a distant planet called Hyperion. And on this planet, there are these mysterious structures called the Time Tombs. And they seem to like defy the laws of physics. Guarding the Time Tombs is a creature known as the Shrike. And the Shrike is like this giant dark figure who looks as though he's made of knives and broken glass. And he's got like these terrifying abilities. The Shrike has been spotted by the inhabitants of Hyperion and is causing all this havoc on the planet. You know, everyone's terrified. Meanwhile, these 7 pilgrims are all journeying further and further toward the Shrike. I think what makes Hyperion so great is that it's not just about their pilgrimage. It's not just one story. It's actually a collection of short stories, and each is told from the perspective of one of the pilgrims. Every character has their own secrets, their own reasons for being on that journey, and as they get closer to the Time Tombs, they share their stories with one another. And I felt as though learning about each of their backstories was brilliant. I was always excited to pick up the book, to find out about one of these mysterious characters, maybe someone that's been keeping quiet in the group and you want to know about them, you know, you want to learn about their history. Even though this is clearly obviously a sci-fi, it does blend multiple genres. There's like a detective noir story, there's a comedy, there's a romance, there's this kind of high-octane military sci-fi. And I think this means that when you read this, everyone is going to have their favorite story within Hyperion. I definitely have, you know, stories that I enjoyed a lot more than others. Some of them I thought were okay, but the best ones were phenomenal. Also, the world building in this book is absolutely next level. So if you enjoy just getting lost in another world, in a land just completely foreign to anything else that you know, then you're really gonna enjoy this. However, I will also say this, just as a bit of an FYI, because the world building is so dense, I would advise that if you pick up this book and you haven't read it before, to go into it with a bit of an open mind, because in my opinion, the first 50 pages or so can be a bit challenging. They're packed with new terms, new place names that might feel a little bit overwhelming at first. The author isn't really holding your hand through this. It's just sort of throwing these terms out there with no context. But if you stick with it, then everything starts to fall into place and the story becomes incredibly rewarding. And I feel like with every story that each of the characters tell, it's like you're being handed out another piece of the puzzle until slowly you start to see the complete picture of why things are the way they are. Really phenomenal. Next up is The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. I don't really scare that easily when it comes to books or movies, honestly, but The Exorcist is easily one of the most terrifying reads that I've ever picked up. I would say the main character in this book, there's a couple of protagonists in the book, but in my opinion, the main character is about a mother, Chris, who is trying to save her daughter, Reagan, as she is gradually overtaken by a demonic possession. And what really stood out to me about this book was the tone of realism throughout the story. And I know that's a bit weird to say about something supernatural, but it really does feel quite realistic. And I say that as someone who doesn't really believe in like ghosts and demons and stuff like that. But yeah, there was like a level of authenticity to this book. And I think one of the things that made it feel authentic is that Chris, the mother, didn't jump straight to the supernatural explanations. She's really like reluctant to believe that her daughter is being possessed. And so she leans heavily on doctors and scientists, as I think most people would at first. She exhausts every other option first. So she's doing medical tests, brain scans, psychiatry. So by the time she does turn to priests, it's clear that she's just at the end of her rope. She's doing what any desperate parent would do. Also, another protagonist, a priest, is battling his own crisis of faith, and that adds another layer of depth to the story. He's got all of his inner struggles, and I felt like that was a really great subplot as well. Yeah, this book is just filled with great characters. The dialogue as well is really strong. The author kind of like takes his time and allows the characters just to be normal people with normal lives, even though they're in these extraordinary circumstances. In their dialogue, there's kind of like a natural rhythm to the way that they're all speaking with each other. And there's these quiet moments where people can just talk about, you know, how do you take your coffee and stuff like that. Even though these crazy things are going on around them, they just need a little break. They need to step away, have a cup of coffee, talk about their college days, talk about anything, just to get their mind off of it for a second. And then they go back into the terror in Reagan's bedroom. And when they go in, because they've had that quiet moment of reflection, it hits harder. Wow, that's a loud punch. That was like a sound effect. Talking about the horror as well, the possession scenes are really intense. And I think maybe even more so than in the movie adaptation. It's been a long time since I saw the film, and so some of the things that were happening and some of the things that were being said by someone who appears as a little girl were... I mean, there were some moments when my jaw was on the floor. I was like, oh, God, no. I think it would have been really easy for the author to tone it down a little bit, especially because this is about a little child, you know? But I'm glad that he didn't, because the rawness of those moments made it feel like you really were in the presence of pure evil. Next book that I loved was The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. If you've already read Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy or Best Served Cold, then I feel like picking up The Heroes is a bit of a no-brainer, you know? You really should jump on that as soon as possible. This book takes place over the course of just a few days, over the course of like a battle for a territory that two armies want to lay claim to. And there's a really large cast of characters on either side of the conflict, and the book is constantly switching between the perspectives of people who are fighting or making orders on the battlefield or just witnessing the battle or, you know, getting swept up by it. As Joe Abercrombie often does, this book brings back characters, multiple characters that we've met in previous stories, and I always love when that happens. But he also introduces new characters who I loved just as much. And I hope that some of them, the ones that survived the battle anyway, come back later on as well. Because, I mean, if there's one thing about Joe Abercrombie, look, say one thing for Joe Abercrombie. Say he can write a compelling character. Even though this is a standalone novel, Because it's set in the First Law universe, I definitely recommend reading the books that came before it first, specifically, like I mentioned, the First Law trilogy and Best Served Cold. You could technically pick this up and enjoy it on its own, but I just feel like knowing the history of some of the characters adds a lot of depth to the story, and you're sort of rooting for certain characters that you've spent time with in the past. And when two characters that you know intimately come face to face on the battlefield and they just don't know anything about one another, you're kind of like, like just you don't know who you're supposed to be rooting for, because everyone is morally grey in this universe. No one's the good guy or the bad guy. And sometimes when people are a darker shade of grey, you like them a bit more, actually. The book is just packed with all of Joe Abercrombie's trademarks. Like I say, morally grey characters, hilarious dark humour. Joe Abercrombie is one of the rare writers that can actually make me laugh out loud, literally. There's political scheming, there's people trying to climb the ladder of power, there's cynical takes on heroism. I think what amazes me the most about it is that despite such a large cast of characters, every character feels so distinct. And as I mentioned, this is partly thanks to Abercrombie's talent for crafting complex characters, but also I think it's largely in part due to Stephen Pacey's incredible narration. He's probably one of my favorite audiobook narrators. I say that as an audiobook narrator myself. As I always say, Stephen Pacey is the bloke that I'm trying to be, unsuccessfully, but I'm trying my best. And listening to this story on audio, I think really enhances the experience for me. It's one of those times where I would probably recommend the audiobook over reading it. I read some, listened to the audiobook some, but yeah, Stephen Pacey just brings these characters to life. It's really remarkable. All right, we're cracking into the top 5 now with Misery by Stephen King. This is about a famous author, Paul Sheldon, who gets into a car accident and is rescued by his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes. But her rescue and her hospitality turns into a little bit of a nightmare when she says to him, "Look, you're my favourite author, but I've got a bit of a problem with your last book, big bloody problem actually, and you're gonna rewrite it, my son. You're gonna write it for me, and you're gonna write this book just for me. And I'm not letting you go nowhere until you've done it." This book is just so tense. There's like a psychological battle of survival between this author and a dangerously obsessive fan. Annie Wilkes, I feel like might just be one of my favourite Stephen King villains, possibly even one of my favourite Stephen King characters just in general of all time. And I think what makes her so terrifying is how completely unpredictable she is. Her mood just swings wildly. At one moment she's so motherly and kind, and then suddenly she's completely vindictive, and then she's offended and scared, and then she's jealous or she's overjoyed. Oh good, it was just a big misunderstanding. Oh, I'm sorry I hit you, silly me. This sort of like emotional volatility really keeps you on the edge, especially since Paul Sheldon is injured and bedridden and completely confined to this like claustrophobic little bedroom in the middle of nowhere and just entirely at her mercy. No one knows he's even missing for a lot of the book. This truly is the stuff of nightmares. If you've only seen the movie, and don't get me wrong, I love the movie. Great movie, banger of a movie. But if you've only seen the movie, I think you should still read the book because it's much gorier. And I actually made a movie versus book comparison video on this channel. So if that's something that you're into, then maybe you can check it out on the channel. I love making these kind of like videos where I compare the book to the movie or the TV series or the game or something like that. So if you like that sort of thing, then don't forget to subscribe, baby. The next book is Death. What is this? Book number 4? Yeah, the 4th best book that I read in 2024 is Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. So I didn't anticipate that I would love this book as much as I did. And it's completely different from anything else on the list because it's not written as a novel. It's actually written as a stage play, complete with stage directions, and you got like the little names next to the characters' dialogue. But that didn't take anything away from the experience that I had with it at all. I was completely immersed in the story. I fell in love with all of the characters, and it felt as though it was just unfolding right in front of me, as if I were watching a stage production. Arthur Miller tackles these, I would say timely, but really probably more appropriate to say timeless themes in this play. The kind of like unattainable, idealized version of the American dream, complex family dynamics, and maybe like the painful realization that the people that you looked up to, like your dad, or even the people that you put so much pride into, like your son, they're not superheroes. They're flawed. And, you know, sort of witnessing that unfold over the period of this book, which really is just like over the course of like a couple of days, it's really difficult to watch, you know, the characters all having these realizations. I think what makes Death of a Salesman so heartbreaking is Willy Loman. He is definitely deeply flawed, but also I think that's why he's so relatable, because he feels like a real person, maybe someone that you've known in your life. He's got big dreams, and he's suffered a lot of failures in his life. And so these sort of delusions that he has of, I'm just one sale away, I'm going to make it big, I'm going to do this, and then and then everything's going to be great. As soon as I do that, as soon as I do this, and you're going to get that job, and you're going to, get that contract, and we're just going to be so happy. He's like putting his happiness on hold. And that just felt really heartbreaking. It felt so real. I think because of how relatable it is, especially if maybe you're from like a working class family, like I feel like 95% of people are, then you're going to really relate to a lot of the things that happen in this book / play. No matter what your background is, you're going to find something to connect with, either through your own life experiences or conversations that echo the ones that you've had with friends or family in the past. That kind of weight of unrealistic expectations, whether that's placed on you by others or the ones that you place on yourself. And that sort of crushing guilt that you feel when you feel as though maybe like you've let everyone down and you didn't fully realize your potential. I mean, you can't help but feel empathy for seeing that so realistically portrayed. Okay, so now we're getting into the top 3, and coming in at number 3 is The Dark Forest by Liu Cixin. This is the second book in the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, which explores, I'm not going to give like any spoilers for this book because, you might not have read the first book even. So I'm not really going to say too much of what happens specifically in this book. I'm going to talk more about the trilogy as a whole, really. The trilogy is about like humanity's first contact with another planet and how Earth might react to discovering intelligent life and how that planet might react to discovering us. You might recognize that story. You may have seen it on Netflix. The 3 Body Problem is the name of the show. And don't worry, if you didn't know it was on Netflix, really considerate of them. They've put a sticker on the book to let me know that this is a Netflix show and I can't peel it off. So nice of them, very thoughtful in a way. I'm honestly surprised by how much I love this book, especially since I always say on this channel that like I'm very character focused, and if a book doesn't have well-developed characters, I'm probably not gonna like it. But this book did not have very well-developed characters, and I bloody loved it. This book is more so about like the theories and the ideas, but they're so epic in their scale, so terrifying that they just completely captured my imagination. So we're not really getting in zooming in on the characters as much as we are zooming out and looking at humanity as a whole, really. I couldn't stop thinking about this book after I finished it. The ideas really are impactful, and there's a scene in this book that might be the most terrifying thing that I've read all year. And that probably sounds a bit unusual considering that I've read The Exorcist and I've read a lot of Stephen King this year. This isn't a horror book in the traditional sense, but the feeling that I felt was like a deep existential kind of dread, just like uniquely human fear that hit me pretty hard. I was just flipping through the pages, just eyes getting wider and wider. Out of all the books that I've read this year as well, I'll say that The Dark Forest is probably the hardest one to recommend because it's not going to be for everyone. Most of the other books that I've spoken about, I feel like have a much broader appeal, but this one, it got me. It got me good. The second best book that I read in 2024 is 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Yeah, Stephen King gets 2 spots in this list. Very cheeky of him, but you know, what can I say? He's good. I've read about 30 Stephen King books now. Just over 30, I think, in the last couple of years. And so it's no small thing when I say this is my favorite Stephen King book of them all. And it's a chunky boy. Look, it's almost as wide as my head. And my head is wide, man. Like, at Christmas, I can't put on those crowns. They just tear because I've got a watermelon for a head. Yeah, this book is an easy 5-star read for me. It's a time travel story about Jake Epping. He's a high school teacher who discovers a portal to the past and ends up on a mission to stop the assassination of JFK. He feels as though if he can do this one thing, if he can stop this one moment in history, then he will rectify so many other things that happened as a result of that, right? We were talking about things like the Vietnam War and the assassination of Martin Luther King and just all of these other things that happened because of this genesis of an evil act. It's funny because reading this book and the portrayal of the 1950s and the 1960s, it made me feel like a strange nostalgia for a time that I have never lived through. All of the historical details and how real events are woven into the story, I think are incredibly well done. It made everything feel vivid and alive. And also, just like I mentioned in the Assassin's Apprentice, there are small sensory details that Stephen King includes that makes everything feel kind of authentic. Like the character, when he originally goes back, when he eats food or when he has like a milkshake or something like that, the flavors feel richer. Like everything is cooked in butter and fried with sugar spread all over it. And I felt like that really captured the more like carefree vibe of the time for certain people, right? Obviously for certain people. Because at the same time, Stephen King doesn't ignore the harsh realities that were faced by others who weren't white or straight, basically, during that era. There was a romantic subplot, which I really wasn't expecting, but it added like a surprising amount of emotional weight to the story. And I also loved the suspense of seeing how time travel plays out and the ripple effects that it creates. I feel like those moments were some of the most intense, definitely. And the ending, perfect. Perfect. So perfect, I just had to make a horse noise. I've been let down. I've spoken about on this channel a few times how I've been let down by Stephen King's endings before. I feel like that's a pretty common opinion, but this one was probably his best ending, one of his best endings anyway. Just absolutely fantastic from start to finish. Just before I talk about my favorite book of all time, a lot of people I find get a lot of their book recommendations from the comments section. And I've got a lot of great recommendations from the comments section as well. So I'd really love it if right down there, you just took a moment to type in your favorite book that you read all year. Just has to be the best one. Doesn't have to be a top 10 list. You can be if you want it to be, but just put your favorite book that you read last year, and then we can all get some nice juicy recommendations from each other. Do you know what I mean? I feel like a lot of us have very similar taste in books. Anyway, let's talk about the best book that I read in 2024. It's the moment. It's here. The best book that I read in 2024 is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. Oh, man, I love this book, man. The characters just feel so real. The language was simple but beautiful. The dialogue was so naturalistic that it felt more like overhearing conversations than reading a book. And I just have so many things to say about this book that I actually made a dedicated full video all about this book. It's a non-spoiler review, but just really reasons why you should read this book. And if you'd like to watch that, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for spending time on me this year. And I hope that we'll all get to hang out again in 2025 too, and have some more literary adventures together, and maybe find some more all-time favorites. If you enjoyed this video, I hope that you'll subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And as always, happy reading and Happy New Year.